There she is. All right. Hello, everybody. Thanks for coming. So Audrey has been a student in the Urban Planning and Sustainable Development program for several years now, and I've had the pleasure of having Audrey in many of my classes. And I don't know, was it in the spring, last spring maybe, that you
Yes.
came to me and was like, I have this idea and I want to do it. And I was like, I know nothing about this topic, so let's go for it. And as Audrey was conducting and starting to do some of the research, it connected with one of my classes, community development, in the fall. And so one of the topics of one of the sessions was around healthy community. Now I can't even say the word around it. Healthy communities. What does this mean? And so I invited Audrey to present in that class. And that was really exciting and gave a little bit of opportunity to start sharing some of the research that Audrey's been collecting and doing so much reading. Oh my goodness. And I think what I've really appreciated is just how self-motivated and the ability to complete tasks and get them done by a timeline. And it has been really a pleasure to be able to work with Audrey. And every time we met, there was new information and new things to share, new avenues to explore. So I've really enjoyed working with you. So thank you.
Okay, everyone, thank you for coming. We have so much to get through in 30 minutes, so I will try my best and we're just going to jump right in. This is Cities for Everybody. Press the arrows. So this is our agenda. This is our agenda for the day. I'm just going to start with an introduction, talk about some terminology I'm going to use throughout the presentation, my methods, how I got here, some foundations of the fat liberation movement, and some historical context to transition us into the things that I learned. And then we're going to talk about physical activity and the built environment with a bunch of subheadings there. And then food security, food justice, and access to healthy food and what that means. And then conclude with the importance of this work and future implications. So to introduce these ideas, I got some terminology that I'm going to use. Throughout the presentation, I'm going to be using the word fat, which has historically been used as an insult, but it's being reclaimed as a neutral descriptor. So that's the word that I will use. And then the words overweight and obese, I will be putting in quotations throughout the presentation because these terms originated from the body mass index, or the BMI, which is a fundamentally flawed metric of health. These terms are also commonly used in the medical field, which has been historically very unkind to fat people. And these terms are tied to the notion that fatness is a problem that needs to be fixed. I try to use these terms as little as possible, but they are the terms used in a lot of the literature, so I have to use them a little bit. And then healthy as well, I'm putting in quotations because it looks different for everyone. We use the term healthy as if we all have a common understanding of what it means, but really it means something different for everyone. The example I like to give is that everyone's like, oh, running is healthy. Well, what if it's over 100 degrees outside and you haven't had water all day? Then it's not so healthy. And here are my methods. In the fall, I read 3 books about the history of fatness and weight stigma. And then in the winter, I used a handful of keywords to find literature connecting fatness to the built environment. And I ended up finding a series of publications that form a narrative that explain how weight got so embedded into urban planning literature. And you'll see that in the next slide. And I found a bunch of common errors and contradictions and misconceptions about fatness in urban planning literature. And then finally in the spring, I wrote my final research paper and created this presentation. So here's the narrative that I found that kind of explains how fatness got embedded in urban planning literature. It all started in 1996 with the Surgeon General's report on physical activity and health. It suggested that people in the United States were overwhelmingly not exercising enough. And so then in 2002, the American Journal of Preventive Medicine which mainly focused on this issue, focused on diabetes prevention, published a study that found that exercise could combat the onset of type 2 diabetes. And they ended up suggesting, hey, maybe we could alter the built environment to help support physical activity more. And then as a response to that, 3 publications came out, one from the Institute of Transportation Journal, or the ITE Journal, and this one discussed how active modes of transportation could increase opportunities for exercise. And then the American Journal of Public Health published an issue specifically blaming suburbs and car dependency for the obesity epidemic, reporting that Americans were not getting enough exercise because we drive everywhere instead of walking or biking. And then the American Journal of Health Promotion published an issue that brought some nuance to the conversation, talking about how the decision to be physically active is multifaceted. And then in 2005, the American Journal of Preventive Medicine published another journal issue about this topic, specifically talking about the active living research program and how the built environment can influence our behaviors, thinking, and health. And then finally, the Journal of the American Planning Association published an issue on planning and health. And they approached it with quite a bit of caution, talking about wanting to avoid environmental determinism, which is the idea that your physical environment dictates your behavior. And there's been quite a racist history with urban planners and environmental determinism, so they were pretty apprehensive to repeat that. Yeah. So let's talk about the foundations of the fat liberation movement. So here's some things we've gotten wrong about fatness. First of all, the body mass index, or the BMI, it's what's on your after visit summary usually when you go to the doctor, and it's based off your height and weight and categorizes you as underweight, normal weight, overweight, or obese. Height and weight tables have circulated through doctors' offices since the early 1900s. And the BMI was created almost 200 years ago by a social physicist named Adolf Quetelet. And he was also, fun fact about him, the co-founder of the School of Positivist Criminology, a racist pseudoscience denoting all non-whites as a separate species. Okay. Right. So Quetelet's index was created using height and weight data from exclusively Western European white men, and he himself warned against using the table for medical reasons at all. He said, don't use it for medical reasons, that's not what it's for. And then in the 1970s, a research team set off to find the most accurate and inexpensive way to measure fatness at regular doctor's visits. And the research found the Quetelet index, now called the BMI, to be the most accurate out of the strategies they tried. But that accuracy was being able to accurately identify obesity about 50% of the time. So between then and now, the BMI thresholds that categorize people have actually changed multiple times, most notably in 1998, when they substantially raised the thresholds, deeming about 29 million Americans as overweight overnight, even though they didn't gain a single pound. Now, because the BMI is based on data from Western European white men, it is proven to be highly inaccurate for any other race or ethnicity. Black people, for example, have statistically higher bone densities and muscle masses than white people, meaning they can have higher BMIs but equal body fat percentages. So the BMI is highly inaccurate for those folks. And then you've probably seen this statistic before. Obesity causes 400,000 deaths a year. That is based on a study that uses old and unrepresentative data sets, a faulty statistical method, and simple calculation errors. Catherine Flegel was a employee with the CDC, and she conducted a much more reliable study just a year later that found the actual number to be about 26,000, which is incredibly lower than 400,000. And that study actually found that being overweight was associated with less mortality than being normal weight. And this study was adopted by the CDC as much more credible than the previous one by Mokhtar et al., 2004 there. Yet it is still cited all the time because it's a huge number that can shock people and perpetuate anti-fat rhetoric. Now, the dangers of diet culture. So each year, about half of Americans try to lose weight, and the majority of those turn to restrictive diets to do so. And study after study has shown that dieting overwhelmingly results in short-term weight loss, but long-term weight regain. 40% of dieters will actually regain more weight than they lost initially. And this is not because of a lack of willpower. It is simply the lengths the body will go to survive. Unsuccessful diets often lead to something called yo-yo dieting, or also known as weight cycling or chronic dieting. It describes people who follow this diet cycle, usually, where you lose and regain weight over and over again. And the health consequences for yo-yo dieting are even worse for you than being fat is claimed to be. And even more dangerous is an eating disorder. Engaging in dieting behaviors is often a precursor to developing an eating disorder. 9% of people will be diagnosed with an eating disorder in their lifetime, which is a higher number than people think. It's one of the most deadly mental illnesses with a death rate of up to 20%. And weight stigma and fat discrimination. So because being fat is often viewed as a choice, fat people are often stereotypically viewed as lazy, less intelligent, lacking self-control, discipline, or self-respect. Weight stigma refers to the negative attitudes, beliefs, stereotypes, and discriminatory behaviors towards people based on their size. And it is completely legal in the United States to discriminate against someone based on their size. That is not a protected class. So discrimination shows up all the time in doctors' offices, work, school, social media, public spaces, personal relationships, and it can lead to a lot of mental and physical health consequences. In medical settings, it can negatively impact healthcare delivery and patient outcomes. Many fat people avoid healthcare settings altogether in fear of being blamed or shamed for their weight. In the workplace, fat people experience not only higher levels of bullying and mistreatment, but also a substantial wage gap. So fat people earn up to 19% less than their thin colleagues. And then for mental and physical health, researchers are discovering that weight stigma is more harmful to health than fatness itself. And people who experience weight stigma are more likely to engage in disordered eating behaviors, experience sleep disturbances, and consume more alcohol even after controlling for BMI. And weight stigma has been proven to produce a stress response, which has many negative health impacts. And weight stigma is associated with poor mental health and higher rates of psychological distress like depression and anxiety. So let's talk about the historical context of fatness and urbanity. So fat phobia and weight stigma most likely originated from racist stereotypes and prejudice against Black people. Sabrina Strings talks about this in depth in her book, Fearing the Black Body, published in 2019. Highly recommend. But to summarize what this entire book talks about, fatness was seen as a result of partaking in the sin of gluttony, something often associated with racist understandings of Black people. Thinness was understood as a trait proving Anglo-Saxon supremacy and superiority, so anyone who did not belong to that social class was viewed as fat and less than, regardless of if they objectively lived in a larger body or not. And as the eugenics movement gained ground, both fatness and Blackness were seen as undesirable traits that mustn't be passed to offspring, and this understanding of fatness as a sign of immorality and inferiority is still present today. So fatness, food, and health in early America. As urban areas began developing in the United States, cities were a point of contention. Cities were often viewed as areas of disorder and areas of chaos. And some of the first restrictive diets in the US were actually efforts to bring order back to the city. So in the early 19th century, Sylvester Graham, yes, Graham as in the graham cracker, that is named after him, created a diet famous for its lack of protein, lack of spices, and lack of sex, to attempt to order urban newcomers. Before 1880, fatness was overwhelmingly understood as a neutral trait. And then by 1920, just 40 years later, fatness was viewed as immoral and outright un-American. And the cause for this shift is actually pretty mysterious. Some people think that it's because dieting was used as a method of compensation for a growing consumerist culture as capitalism began to take hold. Others think it was World War I that made overeating unpatriotic, as it led one to believe you were taking food from our troops if you overate. But most likely, it was anti-immigrant racism that spread throughout cities during the time, and because of the aforementioned Anglo-Saxon supremacy, fatness was viewed as a sign of otherness and immorality. So as anti-fatness spread throughout the US, so too did the strategies to avoid fatness. Diets and exercise regimes became a very profitable opportunity, and today the diet and exercise industry is worth an estimated $2 trillion. All right, so now let's talk about what I found, now that we've covered our bases. So throughout my urban planning education, I couldn't help but notice a recurring theme. Because fatness is often viewed as a problem that needs to be fixed, urban planners have this idea that they can engineer fatness out of cities, but this idea is obviously very flawed, and let's talk about why. So the Surgeon General and leisure time physical activity. So as mentioned before, the Surgeon General's report on physical activity is what kind of kicked everything off. It led people to believe that Americans weren't exercising enough and it was making us fat. Specifically, it found that Black and Latina communities were more sedentary than white people. But that's because they only measured leisure time physical activity and left out occupational physical activity and transportation physical activity. So they ended up severely underreporting physical activity done by Black and Latina communities, as both are more likely to have physically demanding jobs and use active modes of transportation than white people. All in all, it's just pretty disingenuous to collect data on a very small portion of a population's physical activity and then turn around and report that they aren't exercising enough. And so that says automobile dependency to blame. So after the Surgeon General reported Americans weren't exercising enough, researchers began to speculate why this might be. And many turned to urban sprawl and the increasing car dependence for the supposed sedentary lifestyles of Americans, and suggests that walkable environments could help people be physically active and lose weight. But this doesn't make sense because the Surgeon General only cited studies measuring leisure time physical activity, not physical activity done for transportation. So walking for transportation would not increase leisure time physical activity. In fact, it would probably decrease it as people fulfill their exercise needs in other domains and opt to use their leisure time for other activities. Additionally, those who live in the suburbs have statistically better health outcomes than those who live in urban areas, and are statistically thinner than those who live in urban areas. So if professionals wanted to improve the health of Americans, why are they focusing on the population that is already the healthiest? It has also been shown that the built environment has little to no effect on the decision to walk or bike instead of drive when things like weather and steep slopes are at play. This says physical activity for children. So childhood obesity has been kind of a special concern, mainly just because if you're a fat child, you're more likely to be a fat adult. So people think that if we help children not be fat anymore, then there won't be any fat adults anymore. So the Safe Routes to School program was created to decrease vehicle deaths among children, and it was created outside the US. But then when it landed in the US, it shifted to be primarily about getting kids to exercise so that they would lose weight and it would decrease childhood obesity. And creating safe routes to school is so important, but not when the focus is to make kids thinner. Programs like these in schools actually increase weight stigma and eating disorder prevalence among youth. So we really need to be focusing on eating disorder prevention among youth rather than making kids thinner. Okay, this says the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. So this is actually the main reason why making residents thinner has become such a focus among urban planners. The Robert Wood Johnson Foundation is a funding source for campaigns and projects aimed at improving the health of Americans. And in the early 2000s, the CEO and president of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation was just particularly concerned about obesity, especially childhood obesity. And so the projects that they would fund reflected the values of this individual. So planning projects that were aimed at making people thinner would get funding. And so the movement in urban planning was motivated by money and funding opportunities rather than the public interest, which is who we're supposed to be listening to. And the active living research program, they're on your left, was that this program spearheaded a lot of these studies and campaigns and projects. And they are actually just a branch of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. They operate within that broader organization. Okay, now let's talk about self-selection. So a lot of studies in these various journals that I saw do report that if you live in a dense walkable neighborhood, you are more likely to be active and be thinner. But recent studies have proven that this is not because the built environment makes people thinner and more active, but rather active and thin people are more likely to choose to live in dense walkable areas. And so those other studies just didn't account for self-selection when that is probably the reasoning behind their findings. So the truth is also exercise doesn't really affect people's weight at all. Contrary to popular belief, exercise is a pretty bad weight loss strategy. Exercise burns calories, which makes you hungrier, but if you feed that hunger, your weight is not going to change. Let's talk about the real benefits of walkable spaces. If density and walkability won't make you thinner, then what's the point? Lots of things. There are so many other benefits that have nothing to do with weight. Getting people out of cars, for example, increases social connection. People who are socially isolated are between 2 and 5 times more likely to die from all causes. And social isolation can lead to depression, anxiety, increased stress levels, dementia, and even heart disease and stroke. Cars are also pretty unsafe. There are tens of thousands of deaths and even more injuries every year due to cars and vehicle crashes. And cars also cause a lot of pollution. That pollution is bad for us and the environment. And roads also take up a lot of space and decreasing reliance on cars could allow more environmental preservation. So this is a visual that I took from one of the articles from the Journal of the American Planning Association. And it's supposed to demonstrate how altering the built environment will supposedly make people thinner and more healthy. But based on the things we've discussed already, let's walk through this. So will active community environments, will walkable and safe neighborhoods lead to greater physical activity? Probably not, because of self-selection and other factors. Will greater physical activity lower obesity? Probably not, because exercise doesn't make you lose weight. Will lower obesity cause fewer weight-related chronic conditions? Maybe, but weight-related chronic conditions are not necessarily caused by being fat. They're only correlated with being fat. So because we're unsure about this, let's just cross that out. Will fewer chronic conditions lead to better overall health? Well, yes, but we still don't know how to avoid chronic conditions, people contracting chronic conditions other than like increasing access to healthcare and making it cheaper and improving the living conditions of the low income. But if exercise isn't the answer, then we got to turn to food, obviously. So let's talk about food insecurity. So food insecurity and the food insecurity obesity paradox. Food insecurity occurs when a household does not have access to enough safe and nutritious food to lead an active and healthy life. Kind of a loose definition, but that's okay, moving on. Studies have shown that fat people are more likely to be food insecure than thin people. And this phenomenon has been deemed the food insecurity obesity paradox, because it seems contradictory that someone who doesn't have access to enough food could still be fat. People have tried to understand this paradox by assuming that being food insecure makes people fat because they think poor people must turn to cheaper, less healthy processed foods instead of healthy, fresh, home-cooked meals. But it could also be true that being fat could lead to food insecurity. As mentioned before, there's a wage gap between fat people and thin people. Fat people are less likely to get hired or promoted. Therefore, living in a larger body could lead to less wealth and consequentially food insecurity. The bottom line is that fatness and poverty are both incredibly complicated and nuanced, and not as simple as the broader public or urban planning literature understands them to be. Access to fruits and vegetables. This was one of the largest issues I had with urban planning studies on food access. The most popular way to measure whether or not someone was food insecure or whether they had a healthy diet or not, all boiled down to fruits and vegetables. Just look at this image on the left there. That's healthy food, guys. Nothing other than fruits and vegetables. Food access was simply a matter of how easily someone could access a fruit or a vegetable. Obviously, more is necessary for survival than that. The body needs carbs, proteins, fats, and a whole lot of other vitamins and minerals that aren't found in fruits or vegetables. It also negates the fact that more than the mere ingredients are necessary to actually cook a meal. You also need transportation to get the ingredients, the tools and equipment to prepare and store the food, the skills and knowledge to cook the food, time to cook the food, and the energy to do all of those things. So these factors are a large reason why many people must turn to ready-to-eat meals, such as fast food, to meet their needs. And let's talk about the demonization of fast food. Fast food has been blamed for the obesity epidemic since the early 2000s. Documentaries such as Super Size Me led to an overwhelming moral panic about the apparent dangers of fast food. So much so that urban planners have suggested limiting or completely zoning out fast food restaurants from urban areas. But fast food is a really important resource for many people, especially those with children, multiple jobs, and lower incomes. They provide quick, cheap, ready-to-eat meals, something that is hard to find elsewhere. So if fast food is to be limited by urban planners or even eradicated, we need to create an alternative way for people to access quick, affordable, ready-to-eat meals. Urban agriculture, not a solution. Planners have suggested urban agriculture as a strategy of increasing food access for low-income and marginalized communities. Urban agriculture refers simply to the growing of food in urban areas. This could be on any scale, from a tomato plant on a balcony to a full-scale urban farm. Now, let's get a reality check on what urban agriculture can actually do. First of all, it is seasonal. Plants will only produce food a small portion of the year. Second of all, cultivating a garden often requires land ownership because most rentals do not allow gardening in shared outdoor areas. Many rentals don't have any access to private outdoor space at all, let alone places where gardening is allowed. Land ownership is becoming increasingly difficult to achieve, as I'm sure many of us are aware. And if you own a home, you're less likely to be food insecure. Lastly, similar to cooking a meal, gardening requires so many resources. First of all, you need the physical ability to garden. You need the tools, you need skills and knowledge, time, and good growing conditions. And you're only going to be able to grow plants. Again, more is needed to survive than fruits and vegetables. Expecting people who are experiencing food insecurity to cultivate their own food often takes the responsibility away from the government to fix issues surrounding food access. Okay, importance and future implications. So the way they stand, cities are not welcoming places for fat people. The AARP currently has a livability index where the more fat people present in an area literally deems it less livable. Yeah, and that livability index has been upholded by the American Planning Association as a tool for planners to use to assess the livability of their own communities. So because so many urban planning projects have the goal of making people thinner, the mere presence of fat people in an urban area is often viewed as a sign that the city has failed. So much of the built infrastructure of cities is also unusable by fat people, such as bus seats and benches. They're designed with thin people in mind and often too small for larger bodies to comfortably fit. So the idea that urban planners can eradicate fatness from urban spaces needs to be squashed. Cities are places that should welcome people of all shapes and sizes, and without the catch that fat people are welcome as long as they eventually become thin people. So when planning cities, we must plan for everybody and every body. Thank you.